My name is Nancy Baker. I'm a forest landowner from the northern tier of Pennsylvania, way up against the York State border. So I'm in hemlock, northern hardwoods territory. I own 165 acres that was contracted for by my great-grandfather, who was a logger and a sawmill owner. So he did the initial management on this piece of land, beginning in 1861. What am I doing now? Technically, I'm retired. I'm going to have to get a job so I don't have to work so much. I started as a forest ecologist and transitioned to a landowner, and the landowner took over. But now I work with the Center for Private Forests at Penn State. I'm a Pennsylvania Forest Steward, which is their peer-to-peer learning group. I also work with Pennsylvania's Women in Their Woods program, which teaches women landowners how to manage. I'm also on the board of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, where I'm on both the outreach and the communications committee. And I'm the editor for their quarterly magazine, which is called Pennsylvania Forests. What's my connection to the Alliance? It goes way back. My father was born in Baltimore, and he grew up on the lower Susquehanna at Peach Bottom. So I spent my childhood going to the southern part of the state and loving the hot summers and wandering around in the Susquehanna's forests in the south, eating crab cakes. And I grew up in metropolitan New Jersey, but loved the forest and went to graduate school eventually as a forest ecologist. But that connection through the whole watershed, from the headwaters to the Chesapeake Bay, has lasted all of my life. So there's some specific ways that I got connected to the Alliance, but they were through the watershed.
Well, my name is Holly May. What I am doing now is I am a service forester in Armstrong, Clairon, and Jefferson counties for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources for the Bureau of Forestry. I also am a recent landowner. My husband and I just purchased 103 acres of a retired farm. So it's about 60 acres of woods and 40 acres of field in Jefferson County. And I'm hoping to follow in Nancy's footsteps, to really get to know my land inside and out, implement sustainable forest management practices, improve wildlife habitat and forest health and diversity. So a lot of big goals there. And as Nancy said too, being a landowner quickly becomes a full-time job, and you need a job to get away from your job. So my connection to the Alliance is similar. My grandpa was actually the district forester in the district that I'm now working. He was a district forester here from 48 to 53. He retired from DCNR Bureau of Forestry in 76. It was a different department then. But I grew up coming to Cook Forest. I grew up in the headwaters of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, fishing, exploring in the woods, looking under rocks for salamanders and bugs, and just kind of running through the fields and forests up here in the headwaters, upstreams in PA. And as I grew up, I ended up going out on sailboats with my parents. We did a lot of boating and always lived on the water, and eventually ended up living on the eastern shore of Maryland and owning a couple of acres along the Nanticoke River with my husband. So living actually on the Nanticoke and that much closer to the bay really kind of brought the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed full circle for me over the last, 25 plus years. So my connection to the Alliance is pretty strong in that, that their goals and missions really kind of reflect the life that I've lived.
I went through Pennsylvania Forest Stewards training in 2000. And at that time, I already had been bamboozled into being the head of a regional woodland owner association. It sort of went hand in hand because they're both peer-to-peer outreach systems. And one of the partners in our local woodland organization was the Conservation District. DCNR, our Bureau of Forestry was involved with it, but the Conservation District was also involved. And through that connection, I knew Jean Odato. And Jean asked if I would be interested in serving on the Conservation DEC board, I think it was at that time, the board which controls pollution in Pennsylvania's streams. There was a section of that Citizens Advisory Board that dealt with silviculture, and so I agreed to be on that silvicultural advisory board. I was the only landowner that was on it. And that introduced me to how silviculture interacted with streams, with best management practices. And I realized that forest landowners looked at their forests, but rarely looked at the streams, and that the state's watershed associations looked down at their streams and rarely looked up at the forests. And I thought, this is not working. We need to do something about this. And so in 2003, I went to work with a lot of partners and designed a conference. We actually had 20 partners. We got funding from the Canaan Valley Institute, and we had an Enhancing the Watershed Forest conference. In Bradford County, we didn't have a space large enough to hold it. And so we held it in New York, which made New York some of our partnerships. So we were a cross-border partnership. It was a nightmare with taxes, but it was highly successful because we had both participation from both Penn State and from Cornell and from state agencies on both sides of the border. The word got around that we had done that. It was a highly successful conference. And so then when the Alliance began to think about forestry for the Bay, they said, well, we should have a landowner. And I was selected as the landowner right in the beginning of when they began to think about this. They had a format from business for the Bay, and they thought, how can we transfer that to forestry? And it was really an exciting way to talk about forestry over the whole Bay watershed. I'd already had headwaters experience on both sides of a state border, but this was so expanded. And I realized quickly that states like Maryland were so different in the way they treated land and landowners from Pennsylvania that I realized, oh, this is going to be not the easiest thing to bring off. But the conversations were so interesting. We met sometimes at Gladfelter, the paper company in southern Pennsylvania. We met at the Alliance headquarters. So we got to travel around to our meetings to different parts of the Bay, got to talk to so many people. You might remember people's names like Charlie Conklin or Bill Matuszewski. So many people who are still, some of them, involved in this. It was just such a lot of talk and so many ideas that we sort of had to drill down through what was actually possible to what was pie in the sky. And that sort of got off. The meetings began in maybe 2003 to 2004. It took us all the way to 2008 to actually bring it off. And in 2008, Pennsylvania Forest Stewards decided to have their meeting at my land. And that was when the program was initially rolled out. And I was the first landowner in Forestry for the Bay.
So my history with the Alliance started much more recently, probably around 2014, 2015. I have been working with Ryan Davis, who is now a program manager out of the Lancaster office for the Alliance. And he had told me about, we'd worked together with NRCS on CREP and some other programs. And he told me about this great new organization that he was working for, new to him, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and how excited he was to get started working on their programs and how excited he was to be working with their staff, and kind of kept it in my back pocket. And as you know, my husband collected degrees and kind of moved up the career ladder, and we moved around. When we moved to West Virginia from Pennsylvania, um, I saw a position come open with the Alliance. So I contacted Ryan and I was like, hey, you know, this looks like a good position for me, working with the West Virginia Division of Forestry and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, working with private forest landowners, not only on CREP, but on another program called Trees for Bees, as well as the Community Tree Program in West Virginia. So it just sounded like a great opportunity to learn more about the Bay watershed and have an impact for forest landowners on the ground, whether they own 200 acres or 5 acres. There was a wide breadth of different landowner types to work with there and to implement programs. So that's kind of how I started with the Alliance. And then I actually worked with the Alliance then for a couple of years as a forester out of West Virginia. And when our careers were taking us back towards Pennsylvania, I had the opportunity to work on another Alliance program called the Woodland Stewardship Network program, a fantastic program that is still ongoing. It was also a brainchild of Ryan Davis. It really gives private forest landowners the opportunity to have the financial and technical assistance to develop a sustainable forest management plan for their property that not only provides them with short and long-term goals for sustainable forest management, but provides them with a little bit of financial incentive to get started with that plan and not just put it on a shelf. And it also enables these private forest landowners a leg up in the NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program application process. So that program was so much fun to work with. It basically involved putting together adjacent forest landowners, almost forming a community or a network of these forest landowners who are working together under the direction of one consulting forester to coordinate activities and implement their own individual forest management goals. So that was a pleasure to work on, and I really enjoyed that work.
Why is the Alliance's work meaningful to me? The Alliance is a collaboration. It brings people together. It makes it so that we're all hauling in the same direction. It's not competitive as many organizations are. You know, they're not turf wars. We have this overarching goal about the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and for us, the health of the Chesapeake Bay forests. And we can work with multiple partners. And as I said, we're all hauling in the same direction.
The Alliance has such a diverse approach to partner effectively within all kinds of communities, however that community is defined, whether it's a township or a municipality, a neighborhood, or a watershed, however that need is defined for that community or however that community is defined. The Alliance always finds a way to work outside the box and build partners and relationships that result in meaningful improvements, not just for the natural resource in question, which is typically, you know, we're thinking of water quality and forest health for the Bay watershed, but also for the people who live and work in that community. I think it means a lot to them when they see the end results. And, you know, part of the reason the Alliance's work is so meaningful to me is that the staff that works for the Alliance, they have a genuine love for the Chesapeake Bay, from the headwaters to the bay itself and the people, plant, and animals that are within that watershed. And they used a science-based approach to kind of initiate going into those communities, but they care about my kids. I mean, they're either thinking about your neighbor's kids, your grandparents' kids, your nieces, nephews, and they really hope to bring, I think, that sense of hope and excitement about all of the natural experiences that the Chesapeake Bay has to offer as a whole. And that motivation and that meaningfulness contributes to why I support the Alliance.
To me, when I started working with foresters in the 1990s and the early 2000s, they really thought of things in economic terms. And if you had an insect invasion, for example, your timber value was going down. And over the last 20 years, what I have seen is a much broader attention to diverse goals for forest landowners. So I think if you look in Pennsylvania now, timber is probably down about number 10 on a list. Solitude and privacy and wildlife and a whole array of things that were not our main point of attention before have risen to the top. And therefore, the way we talk to landowners has thankfully changed a great deal. If I look at the way things have changed for women, I go way back because I was in school with forestry people in the 1960s. And as I have told some other women, when I was asked if I wanted to go to the National Fire Ecology Conference in Tallahassee, Florida, I said, oh, I'd love to go. And this would have been 1966, 67. And when I got there were 161 guys and me. And that dynamic has changed radically till now. We have a whole cadre of professional foresters, professional extension women who know forestry and deal with landowners across the United States. And that is so rewarding. It is just amazing that that has happened. And I realize that young women who come into the career at the moment think that there's lots that we need to change. And I agree with that. At the same time, the distance that we have come since the 1960s is phenomenal and really something to be applauded.
I'm going to follow up on Nancy's question here about how I've noticed forestry work change in general, kind of over the years. My grandpa went to forestry school at Mont Alto back in the late 20s, and I have a picture of his graduating class. And, it's all white men standing in suits and ties, and, they're all smiling, and it's a beautiful picture, and it's nostalgic, and it's nice to see that. But to hear Nancy's experience in the 60s, and then, my own experience at the University of Georgia, Warnell Forestry School in the mid to late 1990s. I mean, I had a class of, approximately 60 students in my graduating class, and three or four of us were women. And that was in 1999. So now, when I get the UGA log, our graduate publication, and I see the graduating classes, and they're, more than half of these faces are young female faces, it makes me really excited to think about, the barriers and challenges that we've overcome, and the exciting places that we can go, and the real contributions that women can make to this profession, and to working with landowners, and to bringing a different dynamic to working with landowners. I mean, I definitely agree that forestry, even since I was in school, has definitely taken a more holistic approach. It's not just about timber management anymore. It's about forest health and wildlife habitat and recreation and legacy. And, timber production is still one of those goals that I talk to landowners about, but it's not always top on the list anymore, as to what's most important to them, though it is still important. So it's been interesting to see that, movement from more economically driven to a component of a more comprehensive approach to forest management with private landowners, I've found really exciting. But things cycle, they come and go as they always do. And hindsight's 2020 and history repeats itself. So, we're starting to look into more of uneven age management. I think an uneven age management trend is coming through in Pennsylvania, as opposed to the even age management trend that we've had over the last 50, 60 plus years. So it will be interesting to see, in the next 20 to 30 years how that develops and how it improves, the diversity on our landscapes, at least here in Pennsylvania.
What is my hope for forestry, especially women in forestry in the Chesapeake Bay in the next 50 years? I'd love to see a secured place for women, both as professionals and as landowners. I think throughout our history, women have been exposed to being on forested land, but many times they've let the men in their life take care of the management. And I think that is really beginning to change. And women have a very different, to me, attitude towards the land. Women love the land. They may not totally understand it. And indeed, I've had women say to me that they are really afraid of it, but that doesn't mean that they don't still want to care for it. And so they bring a whole different dimension to management. And I am really looking forward to see what happens to that in the future as they begin to have more control over the management of the watershed.
My hope for forestry, especially women in forestry in the Chesapeake Bay over the next 50 years, is that we really engage and encourage all of the different women groups to get out on their forest land. We have women who are hunters, we have women who fish, we have women who hike, who do outdoor and wildlife photography, women who like to just walk out in the woods and meditate or take groups out to do yoga or forest bathing, wildflower walks. There are so many different talents that women can bring to our forest lands, and to get those women, those different kinds of women groups engaged in sustainable forest management would be phenomenal. I hope to do that myself through, I'm a member of our local TU chapter, our local Pheasants Forever chapter. I'm working with our local Ruffed Grouse Society, American Woodcock chapter on programs for women landowners and women wing shooters. Those are the kinds of things to engage those different women groups and empower them and encourage them that, adventure is out there and you can take control, and it's not even about control. It's about educating yourself so that you're empowered and encouraged to take a positive action on land that you own. And that's what I really hope women and young girls do over the next 50 years, and that the women who are doing this, they get their daughters, nieces, grandkids out there and do the same and share these amazing experiences with them.
For women particularly, it's so easy for us to say we love our land, the piece of land that we manage, the piece of land that we live on. It's more difficult for most of us to transfer that feeling of caretaking to the whole landscape and to be the stewards of the landscape. And to make that transition from ownership to caretaker of the landscape is something that I would love to see in the next 50 years.